At 42, Amelia lost her husband, her home, and every dollar she thought was safe, all within days, betrayed by the very family she trusted. She walked away with 2 suitcases and 1 rusted key to an abandoned shoe repair shop. Everyone thought she had nothing left. They were wrong. Hidden behind a crumbling wall was a secret inheritance worth millions and evidence that could destroy the people who betrayed her. Keep watching, because what Amelia discovers next turns a heartbreaking family betrayal story into an unforgettable fight for justice. At 42, Amelia Bennett never imagined a person could lose an entire life in 72 hours. 3 days after burying her husband, Amelia stood alone beneath a bitter December sky outside the modest 2-story home they had shared for nearly 18 years in Maple Ridge, Ohio. Her eyes were swollen from nights without sleep. At her feet sat 2 battered suitcases containing everything she had been allowed to take. Behind her, the front door slammed shut. And just like that, Amelia was no longer welcome in the place she had called home. Her husband's older brother, Connor Whitmore, had wasted no time. While Amelia was still choosing flowers for the funeral, Connor had already begun producing documents, contacting banks, and making claims about property Amelia had spent years helping her husband build. The joint savings account was suddenly inaccessible. The family car was taken, and the house where Amelia had celebrated birthdays, Christmas mornings, anniversaries, and countless quiet Sunday dinners was being claimed by people who now looked at her like a stranger. Amelia stared through the living room window one final time. She could still picture her husband laughing inside. Now she couldn't even open the door. Then Connor stepped onto the porch. "You have what belongs to you," he said coldly. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Amelia lowered her eyes. Everything she owned was sitting beside her feet. Or so she thought. As she reached into her coat pocket, her fingers touched something cold and jagged. A small brass key covered in rust. Amelia froze. She hadn't seen it in years. It had belonged to her father, Henry Bennett, a gifted but nearly forgotten shoemaker who had died 24 years earlier. And that key opened the door to the only thing he had left behind, an abandoned shoe repair shop. Hours later, Amelia found herself standing in a narrow, neglected alley in Riverton, Indiana. At the very end stood a crumbling storefront. The windows were black with decades of grime, paint peeled from the wooden frame. Above the entrance hung a faded sign bearing her father's name, barely visible beneath years of rain and neglect. Amelia pushed the rusted key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, click, the door groaned open. A cloud of dust drifted through a thin shaft of afternoon light. Broken shelves leaned against stained walls. Cracked leather covered an old workbench. Rusted tools remained exactly where her father had left them decades earlier. Amelia stepped inside and covered her mouth. The smell brought back memories she thought she had buried forever. Her father's rough hands, his gentle smile, the sound of his hammer striking leather while she sat beside him as a little girl. For the first time since her husband's death, Amelia allowed herself to cry. She had lost her husband, her home, her savings, and almost every person she thought she could trust. Now she had inherited nothing but dust, broken wood, and a dying shop everyone else had forgotten. But Amelia didn't know something. Neither did Connor. Hidden somewhere inside those crumbling walls was a secret her father had protected for more than 2 decades. A secret connected to millions of dollars. A secret powerful enough to expose the people who had just taken everything from her. And before long, Amelia would discover that the rusted key in her hand hadn't opened the door to her father's forgotten past. It had opened the door to the downfall of the people who betrayed her. The next morning, Amelia Bennett returned to the abandoned shop before sunrise. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the front door of her old home slamming shut. She heard Connor Whitmore's cold voice telling her she had taken everything that belonged to her. But standing outside her father's ruined shop at 612 Amelia made herself a promise. She would never again allow someone else to decide what she deserved. She turned the rusted key. The door groaned open. In daylight, the shop looked even worse. Nearly 24 years of neglect had turned the place into a graveyard of forgotten craftsmanship. Dust covered the floor like gray snow. Water stains spread across the ceiling. Shelves sagged beneath boxes of cracked leather, yellowed receipts, and rusted shoe forms. In one corner, rainwater had rotted the floorboards until they felt dangerously soft beneath her boots. Any reasonable person would have walked away. Amelia picked up a broom. For 9 hours, she worked. She dragged broken furniture into the alley. She filled garbage bags with moldy fabric and ruined leather. She scrubbed windows until sunlight finally entered the room again. By evening, her back screamed with pain. Her palms were blistered. Her black sweater was gray with dust. And she had cleared barely one corner. The next morning, she returned. And the morning after that, soon, neighboring shopkeepers began noticing her. One afternoon, Jason Cole, who owned a hardware store across the alley, leaned against his doorway and watched Amelia struggle to carry a damaged workbench outside. "You planning to open a museum?" he called. 2 men nearby laughed. Amelia said nothing. Another shop owner, Lily Dawson, shook her head when she saw Amelia cleaning her father's ancient tools. "That place has been dead for decades," Lily said. "Some things aren't meant to come back." Amelia looked at the worn cobbler's hammer in her hand. "Maybe," she replied quietly, "but I am." From that day forward, she stopped listening to the laughter. She began studying. Every evening, Amelia opened her father's old notebooks. His handwriting covered hundreds of pages measurements, stitching patterns, sketches of soles, notes about pressure points, balance, and cushioning. At first, it looked like another language. Then something began to change. Her hands remembered. As a child, Amelia had spent countless afternoons beside her father, watching him cut leather and repair shoes. She had forgotten those lessons consciously, but her fingers had not. She practiced stitching on discarded leather. Again, again, again. Her first seam was crooked. The 5th was stronger. By the 20th, it was almost perfect. Weeks passed. Customers slowly appeared. An elderly man brought in a pair of work boots he couldn't afford to replace. Amelia repaired them for $12. A nurse brought her favorite shoes with a broken sole. Amelia stayed until midnight fixing them. Then came a retired schoolteacher with a pair of leather loafers his late wife had given him 35 years earlier. When Amelia returned them polished and restored, the man stared at the shoes for a long moment. Then his eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd lost these," he whispered. Amelia understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes, repairing something wasn't about making it useful again. Sometimes, it was about refusing to let a piece of your life disappear. Word spread. Not quickly, but enough. The laughter from across the alley became quieter. Still, one major problem remained. The rear section of the shop was unusable. A decayed wooden partition divided the workshop, its boards swollen from years of moisture. Amelia decided it had to come down. On a freezing Saturday morning, she stood before the wall holding her father's old hammer. She swung. Bang! Dust exploded into the air. Again. Bang! A board cracked. Amelia imagined Connor's face. She swung harder. She remembered losing her home. Bang. Her savings. Bang. Her dignity. Bang! Then she struck the center support. The entire section suddenly groaned. Amelia stepped backward. With a violent crack, the rotten wall collapsed. Wood crashed onto the floor. Plaster shattered. A thick cloud of dust swallowed the room. Amelia coughed, shielding her face. Then she heard something unexpected. Clang! Not wood, not plaster. Metal. Amelia slowly lowered her arm. Behind the demolished wall, several bricks had broken away, exposing a narrow hollow space that should not have been there. And inside it, something reflected the light. Amelia moved closer. Her heartbeat quickened. Wedged deep inside the wall was a small, rectangular metal box covered in rust. She reached into the darkness and pulled it free. It was heavier than she expected. There was no label, no note, only a tiny lock. Amelia stared at it, suddenly remembering something her father had told her when she was a little girl. The most valuable things aren't always the things people can see. Her fingers tightened around the box. For 24 years, it had been waiting behind that wall, waiting for someone to find it. And Amelia was about to discover that her father's abandoned shop had never been worthless at all. If anything, the real story was only beginning. For several seconds, Amelia Bennett simply stood there. Dust floated around her like smoke. At her feet lay the remains of the wall she had just demolished. Splintered boards, chunks of plaster, and broken bricks covered the floor. But Amelia saw none of it. Her attention was fixed on the rusted metal box in her hands. Why would her father, Henry Bennett, hide something inside a wall? And why had no one found it for 24 years? Amelia carried the box to his old workbench. The lock was badly corroded. She tried pulling it open, but it refused to move. Finally, she took a screwdriver and her father's small hammer. One strike. Nothing. A second. The lock cracked. Amelia hesitated. For reasons she couldn't explain, opening that box suddenly felt like crossing a line between the life she understood and something her father had never been able to tell her. She lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle wrapped carefully in oilcloth. No money. No jewelry. No family photographs. Only papers. Amelia's heart sank. Then she untied the faded string. The first document carried the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. She stopped breathing. At the top was her father's name, Henry Bennett. Below it were technical drawings of a shoe sole unlike anything Amelia remembered seeing in the shop. Layered cushioning, a curved heel structure, flexible channels beneath the forefoot, and a system designed to distribute pressure across the foot while walking or running. Amelia unfolded another document. Then another. There were several patent records, technical diagrams, correspondence, contracts, and pages filled with her father's handwritten notes. One sentence had been underlined twice. Never surrender ownership without full payment. Amelia felt a chill. That evening, she carried the documents to the public library and began searching the patent numbers. At first, she expected nothing. Her father had been a neighborhood cobbler, not some famous inventor. Then the first result appeared. Amelia leaned toward the screen. She checked the number again. It matched. She searched the second. Another match. Her pulse began pounding. Versions of her father's concepts appeared in later footwear technologies, cushioning structures, pressure distribution systems, and sole designs associated with commercially successful athletic shoes. Amelia whispered, "Dad, what did you do?" She kept searching. Hours passed. A trail began to emerge. Years before his death, Henry had apparently negotiated licensing rights through a small footwear development company. Those rights had later passed through multiple business entities, and one company name stopped Amelia cold. Whitmore Holdings. Whitmore. The same family name as Connor? Amelia stared at the screen until the letters blurred. No. She searched deeper. Old corporate filings revealed something even more disturbing. Her late husband's family had been connected to the licensing business for years. Amelia's hands began trembling. Suddenly, memories returned with terrifying clarity. Connor insisting her father's shop was worthless. Connor encouraging her husband to sell old family possessions. Connor repeatedly asking whether Henry had left behind business papers. At the time, Amelia had thought nothing of it. Now every question sounded different. She photographed every document. Then she called an intellectual property attorney. The first lawyer refused to speculate. The second said the patents were too old to mean anything without reviewing the full ownership history. The third call changed everything. Grace Holloway, an attorney with a non-profit legal clinic, listened silently as Amelia explained what she had discovered. Then Grace asked Amelia to read several numbers from the documents. There was a long pause. Ms. Bennett, Grace finally said, do not give those papers to anyone. Amelia's stomach tightened. Why? Because if these records are authentic, this isn't simply about an old invention. Grace paused. This could be about ownership, licensing agreements, unpaid royalties, and potentially a very large amount of money. How large? I can't tell you yet. Thousands. Silence. Tens of thousands. Another pause. Then Grace answered carefully. Potentially much more. Amelia gripped the phone. How much more? Grace exhaled. If the licensing trail says what I think it says, we may be looking at millions of dollars. Amelia went completely still. Millions. She looked around the library as if someone might be watching her. Then another thought struck her. Connor. The house. The frozen accounts. The speed with which the Whitmore family had pushed her aside after her husband's death. What if they hadn't simply been greedy? What if they had been afraid? Amelia immediately gathered the documents and returned to the shop. It was nearly midnight when she locked the door behind her. She placed the metal box on her father's workbench. Then she noticed something she had missed before. A thin envelope remained stuck beneath the box's inner lining. Her name was written across the front. Not her married name, her childhood name, Amelia Bennett. And beneath it, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. For Amelia, when the truth matters. Her eyes filled with tears. For 24 years, that letter had been waiting in darkness. Amelia slowly slid her finger beneath the seal. She had thought finding the patents was the secret. She was wrong. Her father had left her something else. And what was written inside that envelope could explain why the Whitmore family had spent decades making sure the truth never reached her. Amelia Bennett held the envelope beneath the yellow light of her father's workbench. For several seconds, she couldn't open it. 24 years had passed since Henry Bennett died. Yet the handwriting on the front was so familiar that Amelia could almost hear his voice. Finally, she unfolded the letter. My dearest Amelia. Her vision blurred. The letter was not long, but every sentence changed what she believed about her father and about herself. Henry explained that his work had attracted attention from investors after he developed an experimental sole designed to reduce impact on the heel and distribute pressure more naturally across the foot. One businessman had offered to help manufacture it. Henry had trusted him. That man was Richard Whitmore, Connor Whitmore's father. Amelia's blood ran cold. According to Henry's letter, Richard had pushed him to sign away ownership. Henry refused. He would license his designs, but he would never surrender them completely. Then contracts began disappearing. Payments stopped. Business records were altered. Henry became convinced that someone was preparing to claim his work after his death. So he hid the original documents. Not because he wanted Amelia to become rich, because he wanted the truth to survive. The final paragraph shattered her. If you ever find this, Amelia, remember that losing what you own is not the same as losing who you are. They may take money, property, even credit for your work. Never let them convince you that they have taken your worth." Amelia pressed the letter against her chest. For weeks, she had seen herself as a victim. A widow, a woman thrown out of her own home, someone foolish enough to trust people who had been preparing to betray her. But sitting in that broken shop, Amelia suddenly understood something. Connor hadn't thrown her out because she was weak. He had treated her as weak because he needed her to believe she was. And she had believed him. Until now. The next morning, Amelia met Grace Holloway at the legal clinic. Grace was joined by 2 intellectual property attorneys and a forensic accountant, Elliot Parker. They spent hours examining Henry's documents. Nobody celebrated. Nobody promised Amelia millions. Instead, they asked careful questions, compared dates, examined signatures, and began tracing decades of corporate records and licensing agreements. Then Elliot placed one document on the table. This is where it gets interesting. He pointed to a chain of royalty transfers connected to a footwear licensing company, later absorbed into Whitmore Holdings. Amelia leaned closer. "What does that mean?" "It means someone may have been receiving money connected to your father's intellectual property." "For how long?" Elliot looked at Grace. "Potentially years." Amelia felt anger rising, but Grace stopped her from jumping to conclusions. "We still have to establish what remained enforceable, what rights passed through inheritance, and whether any agreements were breached." Grace said, "This will take evidence." Amelia nodded. For the first time, she didn't want revenge without proof. She wanted the truth. And that distinction changed everything. Over the following days, the legal team reconstructed Henry's business history piece by piece. Archived contracts, corporate transfers, royalty statements, estate records, signatures, dates. The deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. Then they found something Amelia never expected. Her late husband had apparently discovered part of the truth before his death. Among older financial records was correspondence suggesting he had questioned Connor about royalty payments connected to Henry's designs. The messages stopped abruptly several months before he died. Amelia stared at the papers. Her anger softened into heartbreak. Perhaps her husband had been trying to protect her. Perhaps he had simply run out of time. She would never know everything. But she knew what she had to do next. That evening, Amelia returned to the shoe shop. Across the alley, the same people who had once laughed at her were closing their businesses. But Amelia no longer cared what they thought. She walked inside and looked around. The restored shelves, her father's tools. The repaired workbench. The broken wall where the metal box had waited for 24 years. Weeks earlier, Amelia had entered this room believing it was the last place left for a woman who had lost everything. Now she understood. This wasn't where her life had ended. It was where she had finally discovered what had been stolen from her family, and what could never be stolen again. Her courage, her judgment, her ability to stand on her own. Amelia picked up her father's hammer and placed it carefully above the workbench. Then headlights swept across the shop window. A black SUV stopped outside. The rear door opened. Connor Whitmore stepped onto the sidewalk. Amelia's body went still. He stared through the glass at her. This time, there was no arrogance in his face. There was fear. Connor entered without knocking. "You've been asking questions," he said. Amelia didn't move. Connor lowered his voice. "Whatever you found in this shop, Amelia, you need to give it to me." For the woman he had thrown onto the street, that command would once have been terrifying. Now Amelia simply looked him in the eyes and smiled, because Connor had just confirmed the one thing her lawyers could not yet prove. He knew exactly what had been hidden inside that wall. For a long moment, Amelia Bennett said nothing. The old clock above her father's workbench ticked through the silence. Connor Whitmore stood several feet inside the shop, still wearing the expensive charcoal coat Amelia remembered from her husband's funeral. Only now, something was different. His confidence was gone. "Whatever you found," Connor repeated, "give it to me." Amelia studied his face. Weeks earlier, that voice had made her feel small. It was the voice that had ordered her out of her home while she was still grieving. But tonight, Amelia heard something underneath it. "Fear." "If there's nothing valuable here," Amelia asked quietly, "why did you come?" Connor's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it." "This concerns agreements made before you knew anything about the business." "My father's business." Connor hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Amelia reached into her pocket and activated the recorder on her phone. She didn't threaten him. She didn't accuse him. She simply let him talk. Connor stepped closer. "Your father made deals. People invested money. Families built businesses around those agreements. You can't dig up 20-year-old papers and suddenly decide everything belongs to you." Amelia's heartbeat hammered against her ribs. She kept her expression calm. "I never told you what I found." Connor froze. Silence. Amelia watched the realization spread across his face. He had said too much. "Get out," she said. His eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Amelia." "No, Connor!" She stepped toward him. "For 24 years, everyone else has been telling me to be careful." She opened the door. "Now it's your turn." Connor stared at her for another second before walking into the darkness. The moment his SUV disappeared, Amelia called Grace Holloway. By 8 the next morning, Grace's legal team was inside the shop. The recording didn't prove everything, but combined with the documents, corporate filings, and royalty trail, it strengthened their case considerably. Then came the opportunity Amelia had never imagined. Grace's non-profit clinic partnered with Adrian Foster, an experienced intellectual property litigator whose firm occasionally accepted major pro bono cases involving fraud and ownership disputes. Adrian spent 2 days reviewing the evidence. When he finally met Amelia, he placed 3 thick folders on the table. "We believe there is enough here to move forward." Amelia swallowed. "With what?" "A formal ownership challenge, an accounting demand, and an emergency request concerning disputed royalty payments." She stared at him. "Can you stop the money?" "If the court agrees there is a legitimate ownership dispute, certain payments may be held while the claims are reviewed." For the first time since losing her home, Amelia felt something she had almost forgotten. "Possibility." The legal team moved quickly. Not recklessly. Every signature was verified. Every contract was examined. Every patent-related document was compared against historical records. They discovered that Henry's original rights had passed through a complicated series of agreements, but crucial questions remained about ownership, licensing obligations, unpaid compensation, and what should have transferred to Henry's estate. Then Adrian found the document that changed their strategy. A licensing agreement containing a clause tied directly to Henry's heirs. Amelia read it 3 times. "Does this mean what I think it means?" "It means," Adrian replied carefully, "they may have had obligations to your father's estate that were never properly resolved." Amelia closed her eyes. For years, she had believed her father died, leaving behind a failed shoe shop. Now that same shop had given her a path into rooms where people like Connor had assumed she would never belong. Days later, Amelia stood outside a courthouse holding a sealed envelope. Connor arrived with 2 attorneys. When he saw her, he stopped. Amelia walked toward him. No trembling. No lowered eyes. A process server beside her stepped forward and formally delivered the legal papers. Connor looked down at them, then at Amelia. His face drained of color. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. Amelia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The woman he had expelled with 2 suitcases now had a legal team, documented evidence, and a court willing to hear her claims. But the greatest opportunity was still ahead. That afternoon, Adrian called Amelia back to his office. "We received preliminary financial records." He turned his laptop toward her. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Amelia stared. Then her eyes widened. The disputed royalty stream was far larger than she had imagined. If her claims survived scrutiny, the case would not merely restore what had been taken from her. It could give Amelia enough resources to rebuild the shop, protect her father's legacy, and create an entirely new future. She thought about the women she had met at the legal clinic: widows, divorced mothers, women displaced from homes after financial betrayal. Then an idea began forming. Maybe this money wasn't meant to give her a bigger house. Maybe it could give other women something she had desperately needed. A second chance. Amelia looked at Grace. "If we win this—" She paused. "I know what I want to do with it." Grace smiled. Outside the window, morning sunlight reflected from the courthouse across the street. For the first time, Amelia wasn't simply fighting to recover her past. She was beginning to build a future powerful enough to change other people's lives. And Connor Whitmore had no idea that losing the money was about to become the least painful consequence of what his family had done. 3 months later, Amelia Bennett stood before the mirror in the courthouse restroom and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Not because she looked different, because she no longer looked afraid. The exhausted widow, who had once stood outside her home with 2 suitcases, had disappeared. In her place was a woman who finally understood that strength did not mean living without fear. It meant refusing to surrender when fear arrived. That morning, the courtroom was packed. Across the aisle sat Connor Whitmore, surrounded by attorneys and stacks of documents. He avoided Amelia's eyes. The financial investigation had uncovered a troubling trail of disputed royalty payments, incomplete disclosures, and transfers connected to the rights originating from Henry Bennett's work. But Amelia had learned something important during those months. Evidence mattered more than anger. Patience mattered more than revenge. So when Connor's attorneys tried to portray her as a grieving widow who had misunderstood decades-old paperwork, Amelia didn't react. She simply listened. Then Adrian Foster presented the documents. Original agreements, verified signatures, financial records, correspondence, and the clause concerning Henry's heirs. Piece by piece, the story Connor's family had relied upon began to fracture. Eventually, the court ruled that significant assets and payments tied to Amelia's lawful inheritance had been improperly withheld and ordered financial remedies while restoring her recognized interests. Amelia heard the decision, yet she didn't smile. Instead, tears quietly filled her eyes. She wasn't thinking about Connor. She was thinking about her father. Henry had died believing his life's work might disappear. It hadn't. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Connor pushed through them without looking back. Amelia could have humiliated him. She could have shouted after him. She could have told the world exactly how it felt to watch the man who once threw her onto the street walk away defeated. She did none of those things, because Amelia no longer needed his humiliation to prove her victory. She returned to the little shoe shop. That evening, she switched on the lights and stood alone behind her father's workbench. The place had changed. So had she. Her hands were rougher now, marked by tiny cuts and calluses from months of working with leather. She had learned how to repair cracked soles, reshape damaged shoes, negotiate with suppliers, read contracts, question financial statements, and sit across from powerful people without shrinking. More importantly, she had learned to trust herself. A soft knock came from the doorway. It was Lily Dawson, the shopkeeper who had once told Amelia that some things weren't meant to come back. Lily looked around the restored workshop. "I owe you an apology." Amelia smiled. "For what?" "For thinking you were wasting your time." Amelia glanced toward her father's hammer. "So did I, sometimes." Lily smiled and left. Amelia turned off the front lights but remained beside the workbench. On the wall was the first patent document she had framed. She gently touched its wooden edge. "I found it, Dad," she whispered. Then she shook her head. "No." Her eyes filled with tears. "I found myself outside." The alley that once seemed dark and forgotten glowed beneath newly installed storefront lights. Amelia locked the door and looked back through the glass. She had entered that shop because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because it taught her something money never could. A person can lose a home without losing their foundation. They can lose their security without losing their worth. And sometimes, when life tears everything familiar away, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is the person you were always capable of becoming. 1 year later, the forgotten alley no longer looked forgotten. Warm lights stretched across the storefronts. Fresh flowers filled wooden planters along the sidewalk. People who once hurried past now stopped, talked, and looked through the windows of the shop that had become the heart of the neighborhood. Above one doorway hung a new sign, "Bennett Legacy, crafted for the next step." Inside, Amelia Bennett stood behind the same workbench her father had used decades earlier. But almost everything around it had changed. The cracked walls were gone. The rotten floorboards had been replaced with polished hardwood. Modern sewing machines stood beside traditional cobbler's tools. A digital design station occupied one corner, while shelves displayed handcrafted shoes, restored vintage footwear, and prototypes inspired by Henry Bennett's original ideas. Amelia had been offered opportunities to sell the business. She refused them. She wasn't interested in turning her father's legacy into another corporate name. Instead, she invested carefully. She hired local craftspeople. She partnered with young designers. And she created something Henry could never have imagined, a workshop where traditional craftsmanship and modern footwear innovation existed under the same roof. But Amelia's proudest achievement wasn't hanging on those shelves. It was upstairs. On the second floor, 12 women sat around a long wooden table. Some were widows. Some had escaped financially controlling relationships. Others had lost homes, savings, or businesses after trusting the wrong people. Amelia knew the expression in their eyes. She had once seen it in her own reflection. Fear disguised as exhaustion. The belief that starting over was something only younger, wealthier, luckier people could afford to do. That was why Amelia created the Henry Bennett Second Step Foundation. The foundation provided emergency assistance, legal referrals, financial education, job training, and small business grants to women rebuilding their lives after financial displacement. That afternoon, Amelia stood before the newest group. "I wish I could promise you rebuilding is easy," she said. The room became silent. "It isn't." She looked from one woman to another. "There will be mornings when getting out of bed feels like courage. There will be people who tell you you're too old, too inexperienced, too damaged, or too late." Amelia paused. "Don't believe them." A woman near the window wiped away a tear. Amelia smiled gently. "A year ago, everything I owned fit inside 2 suitcases." She pointed downstairs. "Now look what grew from what was left." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Amelia walked through the quiet workshop. She turned off the machines one by one. Then she stopped before the framed patent hanging above her father's workbench. Beside it was his old hammer. Still scratched, still worn, still priceless. Amelia touched the handle. For years, she had thought her father's greatest gift was hidden inside a metal box. She understood now that it wasn't. The patents gave her resources. The legal victory gave her justice. But her father had given her something far more valuable long before either of those things mattered. He had taught her how to build with her own hands, how to repair what others considered ruined, how to keep working when the result wasn't visible yet. Amelia switched off the final light and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, She locked the door with the same rusted brass key that had once been the only thing she had left. Then she looked through the window one last time. There was no bitterness in her heart. No desire to return to the house Connor had taken from her. No need to prove anything to anyone. She finally understood. That house had been part of her old life. This place was something different. It was hers because she had rebuilt it. Amelia smiled and slipped the key into her pocket. Once, it had opened the door to an abandoned shop. Then it opened the door to a buried truth. But in the end, it opened something far greater. A future Amelia had finally learned to call her own. Amelia Bennett's journey leaves us with one powerful truth. Losing everything does not mean your story is over. Sometimes, it means you have reached the page where your real story finally begins. Amelia lost her husband, her home, her financial security, and the people she thought she could trust. Yet when she stood inside that abandoned shoe shop with nothing but a rusted key, she still had one thing no one could take from her: the ability to begin again. Her greatest victory wasn't the money. It wasn't the courtroom decision. And it wasn't watching the people who betrayed her lose their power. Her greatest victory was becoming a woman who no longer needed anyone else's permission to believe in herself. So if you're watching this while facing betrayal, loneliness, financial hardship, or a painful new beginning, remember Amelia's story. Don't surrender because someone tells you it's too late. Don't abandon yourself because someone else abandoned you. And never allow another person to determine what your life is worth. If Amelia's journey touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs hope today. And in the comments, answer this. If you had to start your life over tomorrow, what is the one thing you would refuse to give up?